Hello crafters, this is Yana Smakula. Welcome back to my channel. I'm so glad you stopped by today. You're in for a treat as today's video is once again brought to you by Colorado Craft Company. In addition to their Anita Jam release, which I shared on the 3rd of January, they have another product release today featuring the big and bold stamps in one Love Sentiments set. I'm a big fan of their big and bold sets, and they are, as the name suggests, really are quite big and bold and easily take center stage on a card. You're seeing the quick look at the new stamps now. These all have coordinating dies available, which are very handy for making layered cards. As always, there's the giveaway sponsored by Colorado Craft Company. More on that at the end of this video. I hope you'll stick around to the very end. Now, these sets are available exclusively at Simon Says Stamp for the first 2 days after the launch, so January 13th and January 14th, and after that on January 15th, they will also become available on the Colorado Craft Company's website. I have links to all of these places in my video description down below in case you'd like to check these stamps out. For this video, I decided I would make slimline cards. These florals are so large, it is only fitting they are used on a bigger card size. I started working on all of my cards by stamping the images in alcohol marker-friendly ink onto Neenah Solar White 80-pound cardstock. I used my Misty stamping tool for stamping. I knew I would be coloring these with my Copic markers, so I stamped images in Memento Tuxedo Black ink, which is Copic marker-friendly, and similarly to my Anita Jam cards, I re-stamped the outlines once images were colored with VersaFine Onyx Black ink to have true black outlines. When you work with images this big, they are a treat to color. There's room for experimentation. There's room to really take your time and enjoy the process. There's room to try out new techniques or new coloring mediums. I was in the mood for alcohol marker coloring, so I used some of my go-to colors and simple coloring techniques to bring these florals to life. I started with the RV11 as my darkest pink. Here, I followed the black stamped lines that indicate the petal folds and therefore shadow areas on the petals. I also added this darker pink at the base of the petal where the petals would be darkest. I used the flick style coloring method where the brushstrokes leave visible flicks on the paper. I wasn't planning on blending the colors together for a perfectly smooth color transition and blend. Next, I used my medium pink RV10 and extended the color a bit further into the petal, extending the black lines and the petal folds in a way. And finally, I used RV00 as my lightest pink and used it to extend the color even further into the petal. Now, I did not color the entire petal. I did leave a white highlight-like spot in the center of each petal to help that petal look curved and dimensional. In the past, I would always color the entire petal, and then I would try to use a white pen or some other white coloring medium or maybe a colorless blender to create that highlight. It is actually much easier to skip coloring a section of an image altogether to omit coloring a highlight like I'm doing here to have a realistic looking highlight on the finished image. Let's try this approach again on another petal. Again, I'm starting with my darkest color, RV11, and adding it to the base of the petal and inside the petal folds, indicated by the black lines. Notice that I'm coloring one petal at a time. In the past, I didn't understand this concept and I would somehow color the entire petal at once. It is better to color a section at a time, or in this case, a petal or a leaf at a time to get better results. This, of course, does take more time, but the coloring looks better this way. There's more detail to the coloring and more interest to the finished image. Next, I used my RV10 medium pink marker and extended the color further into the petal. The artwork on these florals is amazing, giving you hints as to where you need to add the shadows to make the flowers look spectacular. I love working with images like these as they are a real treat to color. And finally, I used RV00 marker to finish coloring my second petal. I kept working like this, one petal at a time, until I had colored all of the flowers on this image. I stamped the same image twice as I knew I would need 2 clusters for my card. I also later stamped 2 additional single flowers and colored them in the same way as I needed more florals for the card idea I had in mind. I colored the leaves using the same technique. My darkest color, YG17, was applied at the base of the leaf and into the folds indicated by the black stamped lines. Next, I used YG03 marker and extended the color further into the leaf. Finally, I used the YG00 marker and colored the rest of the leaf green, skipping the highlight. If you want the leaves or petals to have more contrast, you can go back to the same colors and go over the coloring to intensify it. I wanted my coloring a lot softer, so I only did 1 layer of color on each of these. Next, I used a Y15 marker to color the flower centers yellow. I didn't color the entire flower center. Instead, I added dots with my marker. This way, I ended up having some yellow and some white areas in the center. It looked better this way as opposed to having one solid layer of yellow, which would have resulted in a flat-looking flower center. I placed the panel back inside my MISTI tool and re-stamped the image. This time, I stamped it in VersaFine Onyx Black ink to have that true black outline. I did this for each of the cards and each of the colored images shared in this video. I love this trick, and I love that we now have tools like this MISTI to allow us to do the double stamping. As I mentioned, there are coordinating dies available for these florals. This is a big game changer as this allows us to easily cut these out and create layers on our card. If you'd like to see card ideas without using the dies, check out my previous Colorado Craft Company videos. I have shared several ideas where I stamp the images directly onto the card background and skip using the dies. The florals, however, offer so much more versatility when you have a coordinating die to cut them out. Now, this card didn't want to go as planned at all. I had one idea in mind at first, but once I started the card, I didn't like it, so I kept changing it until I was happy with the end result. I used a panel of dark gray cardstock and foam mounted the florals in 2 opposite corners, framing that panel in a way. Here you see me using glue, as I've actually already taken the previous version of this card apart, where I had foam mounted the petals onto a card base. I had also added some stamping that overlapped the florals in the previous version of this card, so I now needed to cover that stamping up with something. It was a sentiment stamped over the flowers, so I needed to cover that up with something, as I didn't want to waste this beautiful cluster. I didn't also want to recolor the same thing, so I figured it would be easier to cover that section up. So I stamped and colored another flower and simply foam mounted that over that stamping to cover it up. That added another beautiful flower and another layer to this card, which worked out beautiful in the end. I used a white gel pen, and added some white dots onto the background. I also later changed up the sentiment. I ended up stamping it on a circle die cut and adhering over the one that was heat embossed, as that one wasn't centered in a way. I also added more florals to fill the background in and adhered several clear droplets over the petals and leaves. The droplets are hard to see as they're clear, but they add a nice touch to the card. For my second card featuring these beautiful magnolias from the Thinking of You Magnolias set, I used slightly different marker colors, but the same coloring approach and the same technique. I used G99, G94, and G21 markers to color the leaves and the branches green. As for the flowers, I wanted them to look nearly white, but of course, you can't just leave them blank white as is, as they would appear lifeless and flat. So you need to add at least a little bit of color. You can shade white with a variety of colors. The most obvious choice, of course, is gray, but I wanted to do something different. So I shaded white with very light pink. Here I used RV00. I just added hints of this color at the base of each petal and a bit in the petal folds. This not only added some dimension to each petal and each flower, but also added a pretty pop of color. I love this trick. It's so simple and so easily doable with just one marker color. You do need to use the light marker for this though. I also used Y15 for the flower centers and then added a little bit of the Y35. I finished coloring these branches and cut them out using the coordinating die. Originally, I planned this card as a portrait, but later changed my mind and made it into a landscape. Somehow, I love my slimline cards in the landscape orientation better. I prefer them in the landscape orientation. To add interest to the background, I used the single flower stamp from this stamp set and stamped it in watermark ink onto the background. This is basically the clear ink you would use for heat embossing. But to get this effect, you need to use the kind of ink that not only says embossing, but also watermark or Versamark or clear mark. Some types of embossing ink do not leave this kind of mark, this kind of impression. I think Distress embossing ink is like that. It's just for embossing. So if you want to have this watermark-like look, make sure the ink that you use is a watermark ink. I went ahead and inked up my stamp and simply stamped it repeatedly onto the background. I rotated the image each time I made an impression to build a full background. Now, the background here doesn't really matter that much. I mean, I wouldn't spend too much time stressing about the image placement. You simply need to add some sort of simple stamping to the background to add interest. And here's what it looks like once finished. It looks much better compared to a plain blank background. Here's when I decided I would change this to a landscape card. I also created a sentiment for this project by stamping one of the sentiments from this stamp set and cutting it out using a coordinating die. I love that I have this option, and the dies included in this set cut not only the images, but also the sentiment. I die cut 3 additional blank layers from white cardstock, adhered them together using glue to add dimension to the sentiment. I prefer doing this to using foam adhesive. Sometimes sentiments are too detailed, and it is tricky to cut foam adhesive into small pieces to hide behind the sentiment. It is much more effective to simply stack several die cuts together. I foam mounted the branches using foam adhesive squares and then used glue to adhere the sentiment in between the branches. Next, I added my panel onto a slimline card base. This one measures 3 3/4 inches by 8.5 inches. I then trimmed excess images using my scissors and added white dots onto the background next to the flowers. I love how this card turned out. The magnolia branch is perfect to use on a larger card size such as this one. Of course, it would also work perfectly on an A2 card if this is the card size that you prefer to make. The last card I have for you today features the Just Because Lilacs stamp set with a stunning image of a lilac. I stamped it in black and colored it to be pale pink using the RV00 and RV10 markers. Now, this is a very large and very detailed image. This is my second attempt coloring. I didn't like the results that I had the first time. I didn't quite like the colors that I picked. I took my time and tried to color each flower separately. I did look at the packaging a lot when coloring to help me figure out the parts of the image and make sure I wasn't coloring the stem pink or the flower green. It is a beautiful image, but it might be a little bit intimidating the first time you look at it. So my advice is to take your time and don't rush. Slowly does it. Copic markers are my go-to coloring medium lately, but I can certainly imagine this being colored using colored pencils. In fact, I think using colored pencils would work perfectly here, as you'd be able to add tiny details to these tiny flower petals. By the way, I really loved reading your comments on my Anita Jerem video. So many of you mentioned your favorite coloring mediums, your favorite ways to color, and you've actually inspired me to step out of my Copic marker comfort zone a little bit. So I just wanted to say thank you. By the way, this video also has a giveaway sponsored by a Colorado craft company. I have the new stamps to give away to a lucky winner. To enter the giveaway, please head over to my blog and subscribe to my blog. Leave a comment on the blog letting me know your favorite card size. If you are on Instagram, please also consider following Colorado Craft Company for more inspiration. I'll pick the winner on January 16th or 17th, and I will email you to let you know if you won. I finished coloring my lilac, and here is the result. It does look quite pale, but wait until I stamp the outline in VersaFine ink. It will help bring this image to life as it will add more contrast. There, doesn't that look stunning? I used the coordinating die and cut this flower out. Here's a look at it. I also have my first attempt at coloring it off to the side there using the dull violet colors. Now to finish this card, I used a panel of yellow cardstock and stamped some flowers in the background using the same watermark technique as I used for my second card. I adhered my lilac slightly at an angle. I added a meaningful sentiment. Where the flowers bloom, so does hope. I adore this sentiment. And I also added some clear droplets and called this card done. It is always a pleasure to create with a Colorado Craft Company stamps. I love how innovative and out of the box they are. I hope you enjoyed this video and have found something useful. Love you guys. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week.